and remember this, as a black man, as a black person, as a person of color, my culture has always been important to us. And while we make those songs like Backstabbers for the love of money.
At 83 years old, the man who once carried the whole world on the love train is now completely broken. Eddie Levert, the legendary voice of the OJs, sold millions of records, filled stadiums, and made millions of people fall in love with his music. But behind the gold records and standing ovations lies a nightmare no father should ever have to live through. He has buried 3 of his own children, one son dead at 40, another son dead at 39 in a jail cell, and just last year, his baby girl Ryan, only 22 years old, taken from him forever. Now, with a devastating health diagnosis of his own, Eddie sits alone in silence, watching the same voice that once made the world dance crack and break every time he tries to sing. This isn't just a sad story. This is one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in music history. If you think you know Eddie Levert, you have no idea what he's really been through. Stick with me until the end, because what you're about to hear will destroy you. And if you want more real, raw, and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and let's go deep into the dark side of fame. This one's gonna hurt. 1. A childhood forged in fire. Imagine a baby boy born on June 16, 1942, in the sweltering heat of Bessemer, Alabama, a place where the iron ore mines never stopped groaning and the air tasted like rust and regret. Edward Willis Levert came into the world the son of Blanche Boykins McCloudy and Tommy Levert Sr. But that world was already stacked against him. This was the Deep South in the middle of Jim Crow. Signs that read "Whites Only" hung like nooses over every water fountain and bus seat. Lynchings were still whispered about in the night, and the Ku Klux Klan didn't even bother hiding their robes. Eddie's parents separated when he was barely old enough to walk. His mother left, and little Eddie, along with his brothers Tommy Jr. and Andrew, was sent to live with their strict, no-nonsense maternal grandmother, Mosel Johnson Carter, in a tiny shotgun house on the edge of Bessemer. That house was nothing but thin walls and thinner hope. One room led straight into the next like a tunnel of poverty. There was no indoor plumbing some days, no electricity others. The family survived by picking watercress from muddy ponds and helping neighbors slaughter hogs in the backyard. The kind of backbreaking work that left a child's hands raw and bloody. Some nights there was nothing to eat but cornbread and silence. Eddie would later remember the gnawing hunger that made his stomach feel like it was folding in on itself. But hunger wasn't the only monster. The terror came at night too. The Klan would ride through their neighborhood, torches flickering, voices screaming slurs that a little boy couldn't fully understand but could feel in his bones. Grandma Moselle would pull the children inside, lock the doors, and pray out loud while the flames danced outside. That kind of fear doesn't leave a child. It plants itself deep, turning every shadow into a threat. Yoos. By the time Eddie was 7 years old in 1949, his mother had remarried and called for the boys to join her in Detroit, Michigan. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to escape the South's suffocating racism. Instead, it became a new kind of hell. Their new stepfather was an alcoholic with a vicious temper. The man drank cheap whiskey and took his rage out on the boys with fists, belts, whatever was close. The abuse was constant and brutal. Slaps turned into punches, screams echoed through the small apartment. Eddie and his brother Andrew endured it until one night the violence crossed a line that no child should ever have to face. In a moment of raw, desperate survival, the two young boys fought back, grabbing a baseball bat and beating their stepfather until he stopped swinging. The retaliation was the final straw. Their mother, terrified and overwhelmed, sent them away. That same year, 1949, Eddie and his brothers were put on a bus and shipped north again, this time to Canton, Ohio, to live with their biological father, Tommy Levert Sr., a hard-working steel mill laborer. The journey itself was a blur of gray highways and worn-out seats, the kind of trip that felt like leaving one broken dream for another uncertain one. They arrived in Canton with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the scars they couldn't show. Canton in the early 1950s was a blue-collar town built on steel and sweat. The mills roared 24 hours a day. Black families lived in the shadow of those smokestacks, breathing in the soot and the broken promises of the Great Migration. Eddie's father worked brutal shifts, 12, 14 hours at a time, lifting molten metal, breathing toxic fumes, coming home with hands cracked and back bent. Money was still tight. The family scraped by in a modest house on School Street, a working-class neighborhood that was integrated but still poor. Shoes with holes in them got you laughed at by the other kids. Clothes were handed down until they fell apart. Eddie once said the poverty was so deep that even a new pair of shoes felt like a miracle. But in that same house, something else was growing, a voice. Eddie started singing in the church choir when he was barely old enough to reach the pew. The First Baptist Church on Tuscarawas Street became his sanctuary. Every Sunday, the hymns rose up like a lifeline. Amazing Grace, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Little Eddie's voice, clear, powerful, already carrying that unmistakable soul, cut through the pain. He and his childhood friend, Walter Williams, began singing as a gospel duo on local radio shows. They were just kids, but the music gave them something the world outside never did: control, dignity. A reason to believe they weren't just another poor black family destined to disappear into the mills. Eddie knew even then that he had been chosen. He looked at his older brother, half paralyzed from sickle cell anemia, still forced to work odd jobs just to help put food on the table, and made a silent vow. He would be the one to pull the family out of the dirt. He dropped out of regular school routines early, focusing everything on music, while still attending McKinley High School. By his early teens, he and Walter had already formed a group with Bill Isles, Bobby Massey, and William Powell. They called themselves the Triumphs. They practiced in basements, sang on street corners, and dreamed bigger than the smoke-filled sky above Canton would allow. The boy who once picked watercress with bleeding fingers, who once swung a baseball bat to stop a beating, who once went to bed hungry in both Alabama and Detroit, had already decided the stage would be his escape. The voice that would one day carry millions on a love train was born right there, in the dirt, in the fear, in the unbreakable refusal to let the world break him. But even then, Eddie Levert couldn't have known the real cost. The childhood that forged that voice would follow him forever, and the tragedies waiting in the decades ahead would make those early scars feel almost merciful. Hit that subscribe button right now. 2. The golden years that came at a terrible price, peak fame, and the hidden cost. Then, just when it seemed the long road would never end, the breakthrough arrived like a sudden thunderclap. It was August 1972. Eddie Levert, now 30 years old, stepped into the legendary Sigma Sound Studios in Philadelphia with Walter and William Powell. The trio had carried 14 years of almost there moments on their backs. But this time, standing beside the brilliant young producers Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, something electric crackled in the air. When the album Backstabbers hit the streets that same month, the title track exploded across radio stations nationwide. Within weeks, it shot straight to #1 on the R&B charts. People everywhere were singing along to that dark, driving warning about fake friends, and Eddie's powerful, gritty tenor led the charge. But the real earthquake was still coming. Late that year, the group released a single called Love Train. By March 1973, it had rocketed all the way to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Millions of voices around the world were suddenly linked together, arms swaying, chanting the chorus Eddie poured his soul into. For the love of money, I'll be around. 992 arguments. The hits poured out like water from a broken dam. The OJs went from opening for other stars to becoming the main event. Arenas that once felt too big now sold out in hours. Private jets replaced the old station wagon that still smelled of cigarette smoke and broken dreams. Royalties flooded in so fast that Eddie could finally buy his first real house back in Canton. For the first time in his life, the boy who once went to bed hungry could look at his wife Martha and their two young sons, Gerald and Sean, and say, "We made it." Yet even as the spotlight grew brighter, the shadows lengthened behind the scenes. The road never stopped calling. Eddie would stand on stage in London, Paris, or Los Angeles, hearing tens of thousands of fans singing every word back to him. But in the quiet hours after the show, he would sit in hotel rooms staring at the phone, knowing Martha was back home raising the boys almost alone. The group was now a well-oiled machine, but the pressure to stay on top was relentless. William Powell, the quiet heart of the trio, began struggling with failing health. In 1975, the pain became too much. He quietly left the group to fight what doctors would later confirm was cancer. 2 years later, in 1977, William died at just 35. Eddie stood at the funeral feeling the weight of every mile they had traveled together. The man who had harmonized with him since high school was gone, and the music kept playing anyway. Still, the success rolled on. The OJs became the undisputed kings of Philadelphia soul. They toured the world, collected gold and platinum records, and appeared on every major television show. Eddie's voice, that unmistakable church-trained tenor, became the soundtrack of an era. At home, though, the cost was quietly mounting. Gerald and Sean were growing up fast, watching their father disappear for weeks at a time while the world celebrated him. Eddie tried to be present when he could. He took the boys into the studio with him as they got older. Gerald especially showed real talent, and father and son would eventually record together. But the road was a jealous lover. It demanded everything. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the group had earned Lifetime Achievement honors and was still packing houses. Eddie had remarried in 2005 to Raquel Capleton, and together they welcomed a baby girl named Ryan in 2002, a late-in-life blessing that brought new light into his world. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The mansions, the cars, the fame that once seemed impossible. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks were already forming. The same industry that had lifted him up was now quietly wearing him down. The constant travel, the pressure to stay relevant, the late nights, and the knowledge that every tour meant more missed birthdays and more nights when his children went to bed asking, "When is Dad coming home?" Eddie carried it all without complaint. He had survived poverty, racism, and years of rejection. Surely he could survive success too. Yet success, he was learning, had its own way of breaking a man. The voice that once lifted millions onto the love train was starting to carry a heavier load than anyone watching from the audience could ever see. And the real tragedies, the ones that would shatter his heart forever, were still waiting just around the corner. Hit that subscribe button right now. 3. The golden years that came at a terrible price, peak fame, and the hidden cost. It was March 1973. Eddie Levert stood backstage at the Los Angeles Forum, heart hammering against his ribs. 20,000 fans were already on their feet, screaming his name. The lights dropped. The opening chords of Love Train hit like thunder. Eddie stepped into the spotlight, microphone in hand, and belted out the first line. The entire arena exploded, arms linked, bodies swaying, voices roaring the chorus right back at him. That night, the song officially hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Within months, Backstabbers had sold over 1 million copies. The O'Jays were no longer opening acts. They were the main event. By the end of the decade, they had sold more than 20 million albums worldwide. Gold and platinum plaques covered the walls of their Philadelphia office. BET would later hand them the Lifetime Achievement Award, calling them the undisputed kings of Philadelphia soul. Eddie, now in his early 30s, flew first class, stayed in penthouse suites, and signed autographs for hours after every show. The boy from the Shotgun House in Bessemer, Alabama, was suddenly rich beyond anything he had ever imagined. But every triumph came with a hidden knife. Back in Canton, Ohio, his wife Martha was living a completely different reality. They had married in 1966 when Eddie was 24. That same year, their first son Gerald was born on July 13th. Eddie had been on the road when Martha went into labor. He only heard the news over a crackling payphone line from a tour stop in Detroit. Sean arrived on September 28, 1968. Eddie was in the middle of a 6-week run when Martha called from the hospital again. He promised he'd be home soon. He wasn't. Picture this: 1974, a cold February night. Eddie's tour bus pulls into the driveway at 3 a.m. The house is dark except for one light in the kitchen. He quietly opens the front door, still wearing the same stage clothes that smelled of sweat and cigarette smoke. 2 little boys, Gerald, 7, and Sean, 5, are already asleep on the couch, waiting for Daddy. Martha stands at the sink, arms folded, eyes tired. She doesn't yell. She just hands him a cold plate of food and says quietly, "They asked about you again tonight." Eddie sits at the table, fork in hand, staring at the wall, the weight of every missed bedtime pressing down on his chest. The road never stopped. In 1975, during a sold-out run in the South, William Powell, the gentle tenor who had sung beside Eddie since they were teenagers in the Triumphs, started doubling over in pain backstage. Eddie found him in the dressing room, clutching his stomach, sweat pouring down his face. "It's nothing, man," William whispered. But it wasn't nothing. Doctors diagnosed advanced colon cancer. William tried to push through a few more shows, voice cracking on the high notes, until one night in Atlanta, he simply couldn't stand up. Eddie helped him into the car himself, hugged him hard, and watched his friend drive away for the last time. On May 26, 1977, Eddie stood in the pouring rain at William's graveside in Canton. The same voice that had just carried Love Train around the globe now broke as he tried to sing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." 34 years old, and he was burying the man who had been with him from the very first street corner harmony. Still, the machine rolled on. Tours got longer, money got bigger. Eddie bought the big house on the hill. But every time the phone rang at 2 a.m. in some hotel room in London or Tokyo, it was Martha on the line. "Gerald got in a fight at school today. Sean keeps asking when you're coming home." Eddie would hang up, stare at the ceiling, and feel the guilt twist like a knife. By the mid-1980s, Gerald had grown into a star himself with the group Levert. Father and son decided to work together. In the studio in 1995, they cut the album Father and Son. Cameras rolled as they hugged after every take, laughing, slapping each other on the back. Years later, they wrote the book, I Got Your Back. In the interviews, they smiled and told stories about fishing trips and late-night talks, but the cameras never caught the real moments. One afternoon in 1998, Gerald stormed into Eddie's house in Canton after a long tour. "You were never there, Dad," he shouted, voice cracking. "I had to raise myself while you were out being a star." Eddie stood frozen in the living room, the same man who could command 50,000 people, now speechless. He reached out to hug his son, but Gerald stepped back. The book and the album were their public attempt to heal what the road had broken. Privately, the tension never fully left. In 2005, Eddie found new love. He married Raquel Capelton in a quiet ceremony. Their daughter Ryan had actually been born 3 years earlier on March 3, 2002. Eddie held that tiny baby girl in his arms at the hospital and whispered, "This time, I'm going to get it right." For a brief moment, he slowed down. He canceled a few dates. He pushed the stroller in the park. He told himself the golden years could finally include peace. But the golden years were already ending. The voice that once lifted millions onto the love train was beginning to crack under decades of nightly performances and endless travel. The mansions were beautiful. The bank accounts were full. The awards kept coming. Yet late at night, Eddie would sit alone in the big empty house, flipping through old family photos, the same guilt still sitting heavy in his chest. He had survived poverty, racism, and the death of his musical brother. He had no idea the real heartbreaks, the ones that would shatter him forever, were still waiting just around the corner. 4. The family tragedy, the most shocking, hidden pain. Just when Eddie Levert thought the love train had finally carried him to safety, the real wreckage began. It started on a quiet Friday morning in Cleveland, Ohio, November 10, 2006. Eddie's phone rang at his Canton home just after 7 a.m. The voice on the other end was a Cleveland police officer. "Mr. Levert, it's about your son, Gerald." Eddie's stomach dropped. Gerald, his firstborn, the 40-year-old R&B star who had built his own empire with Levert and LSG, had been found dead in his bed at his suburban Cleveland home. Paramedics had rushed in after a friend couldn't wake him. Eddie drove through the morning traffic in a daze, hands shaking on the steering wheel, praying it was all a mistake. When he walked into the house, the scene hit him like a freight train. Gerald's body still lying there, the room silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner. The coroner's report would later reveal the brutal truth: acute intoxication from a deadly mix of prescription painkillers, Vicodin, Percocet, Darvocet, the anxiety medication Xanax, over-the-counter antihistamines, and complications from pneumonia. Gerald had been battling chronic shoulder pain and respiratory problems for years. The family insisted every pill had come from a doctor's prescription. The public whispered about addiction. Eddie stood at the funeral days later, staring at the casket of the boy he had missed so many nights on the road, and felt something inside him crack wide open. "No song I ever sang prepared me for this," he would later say. 16 months later, the nightmare repeated. March 24, 2008. Sean Levert, Eddie's second son, 39 years old, was arrested in Cleveland for owing nearly $90,000 in back child support to 3 children from past relationships. He was sentenced to 22 months and locked up in Cuyahoga County Correctional Facility. Eddie tried to stay hopeful. Sean had always been the tougher, street-smart brother. But inside that jail, things spiraled fast. Sean, who had long suffered from sarcoidosis, a serious inflammatory lung disease, high blood pressure, heart problems, and diabetes, immediately asked for his prescribed Xanax to manage severe anxiety. The jail denied it. By day 3, he was hallucinating, screaming that his son had fallen into a pool outside his cell window. Guards moved him to the psychiatric unit. Eddie got the frantic calls from Sean's wife Angela. "Dad, they won't give him his medicine. He's not right." On March 30th, just 6 days after entering jail, Sean collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. He died that afternoon. The coroner ruled the cause as complications from sarcoidosis, worsened by high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, and sudden Xanax withdrawal. Eddie flew to Cleveland again, this time to identify his second son's body. He stood outside the hospital room, forehead pressed against the cold wall, whispering the same words he had said at Gerald's grave: "Why, my boys." The family sued the county and the jail's medical contractor. In 2010, they settled for $4 million. The money meant nothing. Eddie had now buried 2 sons in less than 2 years. The final blow came almost 18 years later, a slow, cruel ending that left no room for denial. Ryan Levert, Eddie's youngest child with his second wife Raquel, had been the light at the end of all that darkness. Born March 3, 2002, she was the baby girl Eddie swore he would finally raise right. She grew up watching her father perform, appearing with him and her nephew Lamicah on their family podcast, The Levert Opinion, laughing, teasing, full of life. But behind the smiles, Ryan had been quietly fighting lupus, a brutal autoimmune disease that attacks the body's own organs, for years. By late 2024, at just 22 years old, her condition had worsened dramatically. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, Eddie and Raquel stayed by her bedside in the hospital, holding her hand as machines beeped and doctors tried everything. Ryan would squeeze back weakly, whispering jokes to keep her father from breaking down. On December 21, 2024, she slipped away peacefully. Eddie was there when it happened. The same man who had once commanded arenas, now reduced to a father rocking his grown daughter's hand, tears streaming down his face as the monitors flatlined. Granddaughter Carlicia posted the news on Instagram with a simple purple heart and dove emoji. The world learned that the last of Eddie Levert's children was gone. In less than 20 years, Eddie Levert had stood at 3 different graves: Gerald in 2006, Sean in 2008, Ryan in 2024. 3 children, 3 funerals, 3 times he had to pick up the pieces of a heart that no longer felt whole. He has described the pain as something no song could ever describe. The man whose voice once carried millions on a love train now sits alone some nights in his big house, flipping through old photos of his babies, wondering where the train finally derailed. The stage lights still come on when he performs. The crowd still cheer. But those who know him best say the laughter that once filled every room is quieter now, the hugs with fans a little longer, the silences between songs heavier. Because some losses don't just break your heart, they rewrite the rest of your life in permanent ink. 5. Declining health and a life in the shadow of loss. The stage lights still came on, but the man who once danced across them now moved more slowly, more carefully, as if the very air had grown heavier. After burying Gerald in 2006 and Sean in 2008, Eddie Levert tried to keep going the only way he knew how, through music. By the early 2010s, the concerts had changed. He no longer bounded across the stage like the young lion who once commanded arenas. At first, it was subtle, a stool placed at center stage just for a couple of songs. Then the stool became permanent. In 2015, during a sold-out show in Atlanta, Eddie sat down midway through Love Train, gripping the microphone with both hands while the band kept playing. The crowd cheered anyway, but those closest to the stage could see the way his shoulders slumped, the way his legs trembled slightly when he tried to stand for the final chorus. He would later joke in interviews, "I still get up every now and then and cut a rug, but mostly I'm sitting." The truth was simpler and sadder. His body, after decades of travel, grief, and the physical toll of nightly performances, simply could not carry him the way it once had. Then came 2020, another hammer blow. On January 2nd, 2020, Eddie received the call he had feared for years. His first wife, Martha Bird Levert, the woman who had raised Gerald, Sean, Candace, and Eddie Jr. almost entirely alone while he chased the dream, had passed away at age 74 in Canton, Ohio. Eddie flew back immediately. He stood at her bedside in the quiet hours before the funeral, holding the hand of the woman who had once waited up for him at 3 a.m. with cold plates of food. The same house where he used to kiss his babies goodbye now felt like a museum of everything he had missed. At the funeral, he sat in the front row, head bowed, tears rolling silently down his face while the choir sang the old gospel hymns they had all grown up on. Martha was gone. Another piece of his original family had slipped away. He tried to keep performing, but the body kept sending warnings. In late 2024 and throughout 2025, the headaches started. At first, Eddie brushed them off as stress or age. Then they became something worse, sudden, violent pains that felt like someone was swinging a hammer directly into his skull. Friends and family noticed he would pause mid-sentence, wincing, pressing his temples. In early 2025, he finally went to the doctor in Las Vegas, where he and Raquel had settled into a quiet suburban home away from the Strip. The scans came back with devastating news: a mass on his brain. Doctors spoke in careful, measured tones about tumors, possible cancer, and the need for more tests. Eddie sat in the sterile exam room, staring at the floor. The same man who had once belted out hits for 50,000 people, now reduced to a grandfather hearing words he never thought he would hear. The pain, he later described in raw interviews, felt like someone hitting me in the head with a hammer over and over. He kept the full diagnosis private at first, but the videos and fan footage from 2025 and early 2026 began to show the truth. One night in the summer of 2025, during a rare OJ's reunion-style performance, Eddie stood up for the bridge of "For the Love of Money." The crowd roared. Then his knees buckled. He grabbed the microphone stand to steady himself, smiling through the pain as security rushed forward. He finished the song sitting down, voice cracking but still powerful, eyes glistening under the lights. Backstage afterward, he laughed it off for the cameras, but Raquel later said he spent the rest of the night in silence, staring at old photos of Gerald, Sean, and Ryan. Then came the brutal bout with COVID-19. In late 2025, at 83 years old, Eddie caught a severe case that landed him in the hospital for days. Monitors beeped around him as doctors worked to stabilize his breathing. He lay in the hospital bed, weak, connected to oxygen, thinking about every child he had already lost, and wondering if this was how his own story would end. He survived, but the recovery was slow and painful. When he finally returned home to the Las Vegas house, he shares with Raquel, the place felt emptier than ever. Today, in 2026, Eddie Levert lives a quieter life in the suburbs of Las Vegas. The big mansion in Canton is long gone. He and Raquel share the home, but those who know him say the real battles are fought alone in the early morning hours. He wakes up some nights from dreams of his children, Gerald laughing in the studio, Sean calling from jail, Ryan squeezing his hand in the hospital, and sits on the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness. The headaches still come. The body still betrays him, yet he refuses to stop completely. In his most recent performances, the routine is the same. Eddie lowers himself carefully into the chair at center stage. The band begins the familiar opening chords of Love Train. His voice, still rich, still unmistakably soulful, rises, but now it trembles on the high notes. Tears often fill his eyes as he sings the lyrics he once made the whole world sing. He looks out at the audience, thousands of faces lit by phone lights, and for a moment, the old fire returns. He might even stand for a few seconds, swaying gently, before sitting back down with a grateful smile. The man who carried millions on the Love Train now rides it alone, carrying the weight of every loss, every missed birthday, every hospital room, every graveside prayer. At 83, Eddie Levert still sings. But those who truly listen can hear something deeper in his voice now. Not just the music, but the quiet, unbroken courage of a father who has buried 3 children and still refuses to let the song end. Eddie Levert once carried the whole world on the Love Train, but the train of his own life has been derailed by more pain than any father should ever have to bear. 3 children gone, a body that no longer obeys him, headaches that feel like hammers. And still, he sits on that stage, voice trembling, tears in his eyes, singing the same songs that once made millions feel alive. That is the real tragedy of Eddie Levert. If this story touched you, If it reminded you how fragile life really is, then do one thing for me right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and drop a comment below with the word Love Train if you want more raw, emotional stories like this. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. Eddie Levert may be 83, broken, and still fighting, but his voice and his pain deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one, where the lights are bright, but the truth is even brighter. Until then, stay strong, and never forget, some trains don't come back. Eddie Levert once carried the whole world on the love train, but the train of his own life has been derailed by more pain than any father should ever have to bear. 3 children gone, a body that no longer obeys him, headaches that feel like hammers, and still, he sits on that stage, voice trembling, tears in his eyes, singing the same songs that once made millions feel alive. That is the real tragedy of Eddie Levert. If this story touched you, if it reminded you how fragile life really is, then do one thing for me right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and drop a comment below with the word Love Train if you want more raw, emotional stories like this. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. Eddie Levert may be 83, broken, and still fighting, but his voice and his pain deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one, where the lights are bright, but the truth is even brighter. Until then, stay strong, and never forget, some trains don't come back.